Hello, sleep seekers. Tonight, we're easing into the ultimate bedtime story. The history of Zen, the ancient art of sitting perfectly still, doing absolutely nothing, yet somehow making it profound. Before you drift off into blissful nothingness and forget to hit that button, do us a solid and subscribe. It's the easiest karma you'll earn all day. So, the wooden floor of the meditation hall creaks with the particular sound that only aged cypress makes a slow groan, almost inaudible, the sort of sound you only notice after sitting completely still for 45 minutes. This is important because you'll be sitting still for considerably longer than that, watching a wall, doing essentially nothing, which is apparently the point, though explaining why doing nothing is the point rather defeats the purpose of doing nothing in the first place. But let's begin at the beginning, which in this case means India, approximately 2,500 years ago, when a prince decided that palaces were overrated and sitting under trees was underrated. Siddhartha Gautama, who would later be called the Buddha, meaning the awakened one, which is quite a presumptuous title, but he did apparently earn it, was born into luxury. His father was a king or a clan chief. Sources differ on this. But either way, the family had money and status, and the young prince had everything material comfort could provide. This didn't make him happy, which will surprise absolutely no one who has ever had material comfort and still felt vaguely dissatisfied with existence. At age 29, Siddhartha left his palace, his wife, his infant son, and his comfortable life to become a wandering ascetic, which seems like rather an extreme response to existential unease, but has become the foundation of several major world religions. So perhaps extreme responses are sometimes warranted. He studied with various teachers, practiced severe austerities, nearly starved himself to death, and generally made himself miserable in the pursuit of enlightenment, which is ironic given that enlightenment supposedly ends suffering. After several years of this, he apparently decided that self-mortification wasn't working and sat down under a fig tree, a Bodhi tree, specifically, and resolved not to get up until he understood the nature of reality. He sat there for quite some time. Accounts vary, but most sources suggest around 49 days, which is a very long time to sit under a tree. During this sitting, he was supposedly tempted by Mara, a demon representing desire and death, who offered him various distractions and threats. Siddhartha ignored them all, continued sitting, and eventually achieved enlightenment, understanding the Four Noble Truths and the Eightfold Path, which we won't detail here because you're trying to fall asleep, not take notes for an exam. The essential point is this: he sat still, paid attention, and something shifted in his understanding. He then spent the next 45 years teaching others how to achieve this same shift, and his teaching method was essentially sit down, be quiet, pay attention. This sounds simple, which it is, and impossibly difficult, which it also is, containing both truths simultaneously, without contradiction. The Buddha's teachings spread throughout India and eventually into other parts of Asia. Some focused on scripture and study, others on devotional practices, still others on meditation and direct experience. This last category eventually evolved into what we now call Zen, though it took several centuries and a journey through China before it became recognizable as such. The transmission of Buddhism from India to China happened gradually, through trade routes, traveling monks, translated texts. By the 5th century CE, Buddhism was well established in China, coexisting with Taoism and Confucianism, adapting to Chinese culture, absorbing Chinese philosophical concepts, becoming something that was neither purely Indian nor purely Chinese, but a synthesis of both. Then came Bodhidharma. Bodhidharma is a semi-legendary figure, possibly historical, possibly mythological, possibly both. He was an Indian monk who traveled to China around 520 CE and introduced what would become Chan Buddhism. Chan being the Chinese pronunciation of dhyana, a Sanskrit word meaning meditation, which the Japanese would later pronounce as Zen, completing the linguistic journey from India through China to Japan. The stories about Bodhidharma are remarkable, though their historical accuracy is questionable at best. He supposedly arrived in China and had an audience with Emperor Wu, a devout Buddhist who had built temples, copied scriptures, and supported monks. The emperor asked Bodhidharma what merit he had accumulated through all these good works. Bodhidharma replied, "None whatsoever."
None whatsoever.
This is either profound wisdom or spectacular rudeness, depending on your perspective. The emperor, presumably confused and possibly offended, asked, "What is the highest meaning of the sacred truth?" Bodhidharma said, "Vast emptiness, nothing sacred." The emperor tried again, "Who is it that stands before me?" Bodhidharma replied, "I don't know." Then he left, which seems like a terrible way to make a first impression, but apparently established his reputation as someone who didn't care about conventional niceties or imperial authority, which is very Zen and also very inconvenient for anyone trying to have a normal conversation with him. Bodhidharma then went to Shaolin Temple, yes, that Shaolin Temple, famous for martial arts, and sat facing a wall for 9 years. 9 years. Staring at a wall. Not occasionally staring at a wall while doing other things, but 9 continuous years of wall staring, which demonstrates either extraordinary commitment or extraordinary stubbornness, possibly both. This practice, wall gazing, or Byungwan, became foundational to Chan Buddhism. The idea was to sit in meditation facing a wall, eliminating visual distractions, turning attention inward, observing the mind without engaging with thoughts, allowing everything to settle until the fundamental nature of reality became apparent, or at least until your legs went completely numb, whichever came first. One story claims that Bodhidharma's legs atrophied from sitting so long, which seems medically problematic, but makes for good mythology. Another story says he fell asleep during meditation, became so angry with himself that he cut off his eyelids so he could never sleep again. And where his eyelids fell to the ground, the first tea plants grew, which explains both tea's ability to keep you awake and why this story is almost certainly not true. Though it's a lovely connection between Zen and tea that we discussed at length in our previous conversation. After 9 years, a monk named Huike came seeking instruction. Bodhidharma ignored him. Huike stood in the snow outside the cave, where Bodhidharma was meditating, waiting for acknowledgement. It began snowing. The snow accumulated. Huike remained standing. Eventually, to demonstrate his sincerity, Huike cut off his own arm and presented it to Bodhidharma, which is absolutely the most extreme way to ask for teaching and not recommended as a general approach to education. Bodhidharma, impressed or possibly just alarmed, accepted Huike as a student. Huike asked, "My mind is anxious. Please pacify it." Bodhidharma replied, "Bring me your mind, and I will pacify it." Huike searched for his mind and couldn't find it. He said, "I cannot find my mind." Bodhidharma said, "There, I have pacified it." This exchange is classic Zen teaching method. responding to questions with apparent non sequiturs that somehow contain the answer, if you can figure out what the question actually was. The point being that the mind we think is causing us anxiety isn't actually a thing we can locate or grasp, and realizing this is itself the pacification we seek. Huike became the second patriarch of Chan Buddhism, passing the teaching to Senkan, the third patriarch, who passed it to Daoxin, the fourth patriarch, who passed it to Hongren, the fifth patriarch. This lineage transmission, Dharma transmission, became central to Chan, and later Zen. You couldn't just read about enlightenment in books. You had to receive direct transmission from a teacher who had received it from their teacher, creating an unbroken chain back to the Buddha himself, or at least to Bodhidharma, depending on who's counting. The sixth patriarch, Huineng, is particularly important and deserves his own extended discussion, which we'll provide because discussing things at length is rather what we do here. Huineng was illiterate, working as a woodcutter, when he happened to hear someone reciting the Diamond Sutra and immediately understood it, which suggests either extraordinary natural insight or very good marketing for the Diamond Sutra. He traveled to study with Hongren, the fifth patriarch, who was then holding a poetry contest to determine his successor. The head monk, Sheng Shu, wrote a poem on the monastery wall. The body is the Bodhi tree. The mind is like a clear mirror. At all times we must strive to polish it and must not let the dust collect. This is a perfectly reasonable poem, expressing perfectly reasonable Buddhist principles about maintaining clarity and purity of mind. Everyone was impressed. Then Huineng, the illiterate woodcutter, dictated his response to someone who could write. Bodhi originally has no tree. The mirror also has no stand. Buddha nature is always clean and pure. Where is there room for dust? This is either more profound than Sheng Shu's poem or just showing off. But Hongren recognized Huineng's understanding and secretly transmitted the Dharma to him, making him the sixth patriarch despite his lack of education, status, or ability to read, which must have annoyed Sheng Shu considerably. This story, whether historically accurate or not, established an important principle in Zen. Sudden enlightenment is possible. Understanding doesn't require years of study, and your educational background matters less than your direct insight into reality. Though in practice, most Zen training still involves years of study and meditation, so the sudden enlightenment part is somewhat misleading, or at least not the complete picture. After Huineng, Chan Buddhism split into multiple schools, each with different approaches to achieving enlightenment, which seems ironic, given that they were supposedly all pursuing the same goal, but sectarian division is apparently as inevitable in Buddhism as in any other human endeavor. The two main branches that emerged were the Northern School, favoring gradual cultivation of mind, and the Southern School, emphasizing sudden enlightenment. The Northern School, associated with Sheng Shu, the monk who lost the poetry contest, taught that enlightenment was achieved through progressive stages, through continuous effort to purify the mind, like polishing a mirror until it perfectly reflected reality. This seems sensible and achievable, which may be why the Northern School eventually died out, because apparently the sensible approach is less appealing than the paradoxical one. The Southern School, following Huineng's teaching, insisted that Buddha nature is already present, already complete, and doesn't need polishing, because there's nothing to polish and no one to do the polishing, and the whole framework of polishing your mind misses the point entirely. You don't gradually become enlightened. You suddenly realize you already are enlightened. You just hadn't noticed, which is either liberating or deeply frustrating depending on your temperament. From the Southern School came various sub-schools, each named after the mountain or region where its founder taught. The Linji school emphasized sudden breakthrough experiences, often facilitated by the teacher shouting, "Katsu!" or hitting the student with a stick, which is certainly one approach to education, though not one likely to be approved by modern pedagogical standards. The Caodong school, which would become Soto Zen in Japan, took a gentler approach, emphasizing silent illumination, just sitting in meditation without trying to achieve anything, because trying to achieve enlightenment is itself the obstacle to enlightenment, which is the sort of paradox that either makes perfect sense or no sense, often alternating between both states several times during a single meditation session. These schools developed teaching methods that seem designed to confuse students into enlightenment. They created koans, paradoxical questions, or statements that cannot be answered through logical reasoning. The most famous is probably, "What is the sound of one hand clapping?" Though there are hundreds of others. What was your original face before your parents were born? Does a dog have Buddha nature? What is the meaning of Bodhidharma? Coming from the West. Students were expected to meditate on these koans, not to solve them intellectually, but to exhaust intellectual understanding completely, to reach a point where the rational mind gives up and something else, direct insight, perhaps emerges. This process could take months, years, sometimes decades. Students would present their understanding to the teacher in private interviews, dokusan, and the teacher would either confirm their insight or send them back to meditate more, which must have been extraordinarily frustrating, especially when you've been pondering whether a dog has Buddha nature for the past 3 years, and your teacher just looks at you and says, "Not yet," and rings a bell to dismiss you. The koan system created a kind of curriculum of awakening, a series of challenges that, when worked through, supposedly led to progressively deeper understanding. Though calling it a curriculum makes it sound more organized than it actually was, as different teachers emphasized different koans, and the order in which they were assigned varied, and some students achieved insight with the first koan, while others worked through dozens without significant breakthrough, which suggests either that enlightenment is unpredictable or that some people are better at Zen than others. Though suggesting the latter seems un-Zen, as Buddha nature is supposedly universal and equally present in everyone. During China's Tang dynasty, roughly 7th to 10th centuries, Chan Buddhism flourished. This is often called the Golden Age of Chan, when the tradition produced its most influential teachers and texts. Monasteries grew large, sometimes housing thousands of monks. Daily life followed strict schedules. Wake before dawn, meditation, work period, meals taken in formal ritual, more meditation, sleep, repeat. This routine continued day after day, year after year, decade after decade, which is either the path to liberation or a particularly monotonous way to spend one's life. The work periods deserve mention. Chan monasteries didn't simply sit around meditating all day, which would have been economically impractical. Monks grew their own food, maintained buildings, cooked meals, cleaned facilities. This work was considered as important as formal meditation, embodying the principle that enlightenment isn't separate from ordinary activity, but found within it. There's a famous Chan saying, "Before enlightenment, chop wood, carry water. After enlightenment, chop wood, carry water." The tasks remain the same. Only your relationship to them changes. One of the great Chan masters, Bai Zhang, established the rule, "A day without work is a day without food," and continued working in the monastery garden even in his old age. When concerned students hid his gardening tools to force him to rest, he refused to eat, which seems like stubborn adherence to principle, or possibly just stubbornness, though in Zen these are not always distinguishable. The relationship between teacher and student in Chan Buddhism was intense, personal, sometimes confrontational. Teachers didn't simply lecture about enlightenment. They embodied it, or claimed to, and students learned primarily through observation and direct interaction. A teacher might respond to a profound question by serving tea, or by pointing at a tree, or by walking away without saying anything. And these nonverbal responses supposedly communicated something that words could not, though they also might have just been teachers enjoying being inscrutable, which seems like one of the perks of being considered enlightened. Stories of Chan masters are filled with this kind of cryptic behavior. A monk asks, "What is Buddha?" The master replies, 3 pounds of flax. Another monk asks the same question. A different master answers, "The cypress tree in the garden." These answers seem random, absurd, completely unhelpful, which is precisely the point. They're meant to cut through conceptual thinking, to stop the mind from constructing elaborate philosophical frameworks about what Buddha is, and just point directly at reality as it presents itself, which in one case happened to involve flax, and in another involved a tree, both equally valid expressions of Buddha nature. Apparently, some masters specialized in shouting. Linji Yishuan, known in Japanese as Rinzai, founder of the Linji Rinzai school, was famous for his shout, katsu. He would shout at unexpected moments, sometimes in response to questions, sometimes seemingly at random. The shout meant to jolt students out of habitual thinking patterns, to create a moment of absolute presence where the conceptual mind hadn't yet reconstructed its narrative about reality. Whether this actually worked or just startled people is open to interpretation, though the technique persisted for centuries, suggesting either effectiveness or tradition's tendency to preserve methods regardless of their actual utility. Other masters used the staff hitting students on the shoulder or back, not violently but sharply, unexpectedly. This wasn't punishment but teaching method. The physical shock meant to break through mental abstraction, to bring awareness back to immediate bodily experience. In modern contexts, this would probably constitute assault, but in 9th century Chinese monasteries, it was considered compassionate instruction, which tells you something about historical attitudes toward education, or about Zen's particular interpretation of compassion, or possibly both. The literature of Chan Buddhism from this period is extensive and cryptic. Collections like The Blue Cliff Record and The Gateless Gate compile koans and commentary, stories of masters and students, exchanges that seem designed to confuse as much as enlighten. Reading them feels like overhearing half of someone else's conversation. You understand the words but miss the context, grasp the literal meaning, but sense something else beneath it that remains elusive. Take this exchange. A monk asks Zhaozhou, "Does a dog have Buddha nature?" Zhaozhou replies, "Mu." This single syllable, mu, meaning no, or nothing, or without, depending on context, became one of the most studied koans in Zen. Students meditate on it for months, years, trying to understand what Zhaozhou meant. The obvious reading is that he's saying no, dogs don't have Buddha nature. But this contradicts Buddhist teaching that all beings possess Buddha nature. So perhaps mu doesn't mean no in this context. Perhaps it means something else. Perhaps it means nothing. Perhaps the question itself is wrong, and mu points to that wrongness. Perhaps the whole thing is just a sound, empty of inherent meaning, and trying to figure it out is missing the point. Or perhaps, and this is my personal suspicion, Zhao Zhou was tired that day and just said something to make the monk go away, and subsequent generations of Zen students have invested that casual dismissal with profound significance, which would be very human and also very funny, though suggesting this to serious Zen practitioners might get you hit with a stick. Compassionately, the Tang dynasty eventually declined, as dynasties do, and Chan Buddhism faced persecution during the Huichang era, persecution of Buddhism in the mid-9th century. Temples were destroyed, monks forced to return to lay life, texts burned. Chan survived better than other Buddhist schools, partly because it emphasized direct transmission from teacher to student rather than reliance on temples and texts, partly because its practice of monastic self-sufficiency through agricultural work made it less dependent on imperial patronage. By the Song dynasty, 10th to 13th centuries, Chan had become the dominant form of Buddhism in China, though it had also become somewhat institutionalized, somewhat respectable, less wild than its early days. Monasteries developed elaborate hierarchies, formal training programs, certification systems. This organization probably helped preserve the tradition, but also diluted some of its original spontaneity, its emphasis on direct experience over institutional authority. Zen's arrival in Japan happened gradually, through multiple waves of transmission, beginning in the 7th century, but not really taking root until the 12th and 13th centuries, when it found an audience among the samurai class, who apparently saw something appealing in a Buddhist tradition that emphasized discipline, directness, and the occasional bout of being hit with sticks. The monk Ai Sai, whom we mentioned briefly in our previous discussion about tea ceremony, traveled to China twice, studying Chan Buddhism and bringing back both tea seeds and Zen teachings. In 1191, he returned to Japan and established Kenninji Temple in Kyoto, introducing what would become the Rinzai school of Zen, named after the Chinese master Linji Yixuan, the one famous for shouting. Isai had to navigate complex religious politics. Buddhism was already well established in Japan, particularly the Tendai and Shingon schools, which had powerful temple networks and imperial support. These established schools viewed Zen with suspicion, seeing it as foreign, potentially heretical, certainly disruptive. Isai wrote a treatise defending Zen, arguing it complemented rather than contradicted existing Buddhist traditions, which was diplomatically wise, though possibly not entirely accurate, as Zen's emphasis on direct experience over scriptural study rather did undermine the authority of traditions based primarily on textual interpretation. He found support among the new military government, the Kamakura shogunate, which had recently taken power and wanted its own Buddhist tradition, separate from the aristocratic Buddhism of the imperial court. The samurai appreciated Zen's practicality, its emphasis on discipline and mental training, its lack of elaborate ritual and philosophical complexity. You could practice Zen without years of scriptural study, without mastering complicated ceremonies, which is either appealing simplicity or terrifying directness, depending on how comfortable you are with silence and self-examination. Dogen Zenji, another Japanese monk, also traveled to China in the early 13th century, seeking authentic Buddhist teaching. He studied with Rujing, a Caodong master, and achieved enlightenment, or what he understood as enlightenment, during meditation one morning when he heard his teacher scold another monk for falling asleep, saying, "Body and mind drop away." Something about this phrase resonated with Dogen, clarified his understanding, and he returned to Japan to establish what would become the Soto school of Zen. Dogen's approach differed from Isai's, where Rinzai Zen emphasized koan study and sudden breakthrough experiences. Soto Zen emphasized shikantaza, just sitting, meditation without koans, without goals, without trying to achieve enlightenment or anything else. Just sitting, attending to posture, attending to breath, allowing thoughts to arise and pass without engagement. The sitting itself is enlightenment, which is either profoundly liberating or monumentally boring, depending on your tolerance for sitting still and doing nothing. Dogen wrote extensively, producing works like the Shobogenzo, Treasury of the True Dharma Eye, which is simultaneously one of the most profound and most difficult Buddhist texts ever written. He wrote about the nature of time, the relationship between practice and enlightenment. His writing is dense, poetic, sometimes contradictory. Reading Dogen feels like walking through fog. You sense there's something significant ahead. You catch glimpses of meaning, but the full landscape remains elusive, revealed partially and intermittently. He established Aiheiji Temple in a remote mountain region, deliberately choosing isolation over accessibility, wanting practitioners to focus on meditation without urban distractions. The temple still exists today, still follows Dogen's strict monastic code, still maintains a schedule that begins at 3:30 a.m. and involves approximately 8 hours of sitting meditation daily, which is either deeply admirable or deeply exhausting, quite possibly both. The monastic schedule in Zen temples deserves detailed description, though detailed description of daily routine is precisely the sort of content that helps people fall asleep. So we're serving our purpose here. The day begins before dawn, typically 3:30 or 4 a.m., with the sound of a wooden board being struck, creating a rapid staccato that starts slow and accelerates. The rhythm designed to wake you gradually, though gradually might be generous when you've been asleep for only 4 or 5 hours. Monks rise, wash their faces with cold water. The zendo is a long hall with raised platforms along the walls, where monks sit facing either the wall or the center of the room, depending on whether they're practicing Soto or Rinzai style. The platforms are just wide enough to sit cross-legged, with perhaps 6 inches of space behind you before the wall. You sit on a small round cushion, a zafu, placed atop a larger flat cushion, a zabuton, the arrangement designed to tilt your pelvis forward slightly, maintaining the natural curve of the spine, distributing weight evenly so you can sit for extended periods without excessive discomfort. Though without excessive discomfort is relative when you're sitting motionless for 40 minutes. The meditation hall is typically unheated. Even in winter, the cold considered beneficial for maintaining alertness, though this seems like rationalization for not having central heating. The temperature might be just above freezing. Your breath makes small clouds in the air. Your hands, folded in your lap or holding a mudra position, become numb after the first 15 minutes. This is all considered part of the practice. Training in endurance, in maintaining equanimity regardless of physical circumstances, in not reacting to discomfort, though the line between not reacting to discomfort. Meditation periods last 40 to 50 minutes, followed by brief walking meditation, so slowly that each step takes approximately 5 to 10 seconds. This allows blood to circulate back into your legs, prevents complete numbness, provides minimal movement while maintaining meditative awareness. Then another sitting period, then more walking, then more sitting, this pattern continuing through the morning. Around 6 or 7 a.m. comes breakfast, which is itself a ceremony. Monks remain in the zendo, sitting in meditation posture. Servers bring bowls, typically 3 nested bowls called oryoki, and place them before each practitioner. The bowls are unwrapped from their cloth, covering with specific ritualized movements. Everything happens in silence, coordinated through visual cues from the head monk. You eat in silence, attending to each bite, each movement of the spoon, maintaining awareness throughout the meal. When finished, you clean your bowls at your seat using hot water and a pickle, drinking the washing water so nothing is wasted. Then rewrap the bowls in their cloth, fold the cloth in the prescribed manner, and return to sitting meditation. The entire meal might take 30 minutes, during which no one speaks. No one makes unnecessary noise, everything executed with precision and attention. After breakfast, a work period samu, where monks perform maintenance tasks, sweeping, cleaning, gardening, cooking, whatever needs doing. This work is considered meditation in action. Each task performed with full attention, without rushing, without conversation. Sweeping is just sweeping. The repetitive motions back and forth, create their own meditative rhythm. The same rhythm as sitting meditation, just expressed through movement rather than stillness. Mid-morning brings more meditation periods. Then lunch, prepared and eaten with the same formal ritual as breakfast. Afternoon might include study periods, sutra chanting, or more meditation. Evening brings dinner lighter than lunch, often just soup and rice. Then evening meditation sessions. Then perhaps a Dharma talk by the abbot or senior teacher. Then final meditation period. Then sleep around 9 or 10 p.m. This schedule continues every day, with slight variations for ceremony days or special observances, but essentially unchanged day after day, week after week, month after month. Monks might follow this routine for years, for decades. The elaborate structures of self we construct and defend, leaving something simpler, clearer, though describing what that something is proves difficult, as it's more about absence than presence, more about what falls away than what's gained. Zen monasteries also develop traditions of intensive meditation retreats, sesshin, typically lasting 1 week, during which the schedule intensifies. Meditation periods increase to perhaps 12 or 14 hours daily. You sit, eat, work, sleep, sit again. Days blurring together into one extended present moment that contains all moments. Or, so practitioners report, though it might also just be exhaustion and sensory deprivation, creating altered states of consciousness, which could be enlightenment, or could be the brain, doing strange things under unusual conditions, potentially both simultaneously. During sesshin, Rinzai practitioners have frequent private interviews, dokusan or sanzen, with the teacher, presenting their understanding of the koan they're working on. These interviews are brief, intense, sometimes confrontational. The student enters the interview room, bows, kneels before the teacher, and presents their understanding. The teacher might ask questions, might ring a bell to dismiss the student if the answer is inadequate, might confirm insight if it's genuine. The interview might last 30 seconds or 5 minutes, rarely longer. Students approach these interviews with considerable anxiety, especially early in their practice. You've been meditating on a koan for weeks. Think you've understood something. Approach the teacher's room, wait your turn, enter, present your understanding, and the teacher just looks at you, rings the bell, and you're dismissed. Back to the meditation hall, back to the cushion, back to the koan, wondering what you missed, what you misunderstood, whether you'll ever figure this out. This can happen dozens of times with a single koan, hundreds of times over the course of training. The repeated failure supposedly part of the process, wearing down ego, burning through conceptual understanding until something else emerges. Soto Zen, with its emphasis on just sitting, has fewer formal interviews, less emphasis on breakthrough experiences. The practice is the realization, not something separate from it. You sit because sitting is what awakened beings do, not because sitting will make you awakened. This seems like a subtle distinction, but creates quite different training atmospheres. Rinzai has more intensity, more pressure, more drama. Soto has more patience, more emphasis on gradual maturation, less concern with dramatic moments of insight. The integration of Zen into broader Japanese culture happened gradually over several centuries, with Zen principles and aesthetics influencing everything from architecture to poetry to martial arts to flower arrangement, creating what we might call a Zen aesthetic that became distinctly Japanese, though it originated in India via China, which tells you something about how cultural traditions migrate, adapt, and become naturalized in new contexts. The concept of mu or emptiness became central to Japanese artistic expression. Not emptiness as mere absence, but emptiness as potential, as space that allows things to be fully themselves. In painting, this manifests as negative space, large areas of blank paper or silk that aren't failures to fill the canvas, but deliberate choices that give the painted elements room to breathe, to exist without crowding. A single branch of plum blossoms against white paper, the white not representing anything, just being white, being empty, being the ground from which the branch emerges and to which it will return. This aesthetic influenced architecture as well. Traditional Japanese rooms with their sliding paper screens, their minimal furniture, their tatami mats and alcoves with single scrolls and single flower arrangements. All of this reflects Zen principles of simplicity, of reducing to essentials. The empty room isn't incomplete. It's complete in its emptiness, ready to accommodate whatever activity or gathering might occur, then return to emptiness afterward. Zen temples themselves became architectural expressions of these principles. Buildings arranged around courtyards, connected by covered walkways, gardens of raked gravel, and carefully positioned stones. Everything designed to facilitate meditation, to reduce distraction, to create environments where attention can settle and deepen. The Ryoanji Rock Garden in Kyoto, 15 rocks arranged in a sea of white gravel, might be the most famous example. Nothing growing, nothing changing, just rocks and gravel arranged so that from any viewing position, at least one rock is hidden, which supposedly represents something about the nature of perception or reality. The garden exists in the same state today as it did when created in the late 15th century, assuming the gravel gets raked regularly and the rocks haven't wandered off, which rocks occasionally do through geological processes. operating on timescales that make human history seem like a brief afternoon. People visit this garden, sit on the viewing platform, look at rocks and gravel, experience whatever they experience: peace, boredom, confusion, insight. And the rocks remain, the gravel remains, unchanged by observation, indifferent to interpretation. Zen also profoundly influenced Japanese poetry, typically containing a seasonal reference and presenting a single moment of awareness, without explanation or elaboration. The form's brevity forces precision, forces the poet to capture something essential without ornamentation, to point at experience directly rather than describing it extensively. Matsuo Basho, the most famous haiku poet, was a Zen practitioner. His poems reflect Zen aesthetics: simplicity, directness, attention to ordinary moments elevated through precise observation. His most famous haiku goes, "An old pond. A frog jumps in. The sound of water." This seems almost aggressively mundane. A frog, a pond, water making a sound. So what? Until you consider it as a meditation on sound and silence, on the way a single event interrupts stillness, then disappears back into it, on how reality presents itself moment by moment, each moment complete, requiring nothing added. Or it's just about a frog jumping into a pond, which is also fine, as sometimes a frog is just a frog, which is itself a very Zen observation. Another of Basho's poems, "The temple bell stops, but the sound keeps coming, out of the flowers." This one plays with perception, with the way sound seems to linger after its source has ceased, or perhaps with synesthesia, or perhaps with the realization that distinctions between bell sound and flower scent are conceptual impositions on experience that doesn't actually divide itself so neatly. Or perhaps Basho was standing near flowers when he heard a bell and wrote about it. So we're probably fine. Zen also influenced martial arts, archery, swordsmanship, and other combat disciplines, incorporated Zen principles of focused awareness, of acting without deliberation, of achieving what's called mushin, literally, no mind, where response happens spontaneously. Eugen Herrigel's book, Zen in the Art of Archery, published in 1948, describes his study of Kyudo Japanese archery under a Zen master. His teacher emphasized not aiming at the target, but becoming one with the bow, arrow, and target. Herrigel describes practicing for months before being allowed to shoot at an actual target, just drawing the bow and releasing without aiming. Whether this is authentic Zen teaching or a Western misinterpretation of Japanese archery practice is debatable. Some scholars argue Herrigel misunderstood or romanticized what he was taught, but the book became enormously influential in spreading ideas about Zen to Western audiences. So historically important, regardless of its accuracy. The tea ceremony, which we discussed at length previously, transforming the simple act of preparing and drinking tea into a meditation on impermanence, presence, and finding the sacred within the mundane. The ceremony's slow pace, its precise movements, its emphasis on attention to detail. All of this reflects Zen training, applies meditation principles to a specific, repeatable activity. Zen also influenced calligraphy, shodo, which in Japan became not merely writing, but a form of meditation and artistic expression. The calligrapher grinds ink, prepares the brush, sits before blank paper. and then writes in a single flowing movement, each character executed without hesitation or correction. There's no erasing, no going back, no second chances. The brushstroke expresses the calligrapher's state of mind at that moment. Any hesitation, any anxiety, any distraction becomes visible in the line quality, in how the ink flows, in the character's shape and energy. Master calligraphers can spend years learning to write a single character. Not because the character is complicated, but because writing it with complete presence, without self-consciousness, without the interference of trying, requires profound practice. The character might be mu emptiness or ichi one or Zen itself. Simple forms that become tremendously difficult when you're trying to express their meaning through your brushwork rather than just writing the shape. Some Zen calligraphy is barely legible. The characters so abstracted, so energetically rendered, that they're more gesture than text, more expression of the moment than communication of meaning. This seems to defeat the purpose of writing, which is usually to convey information, to make visible. During the Muromachi period, 14th to 16th centuries, Zen's influence on Japanese culture reached its peak. The Ashikaga shoguns patronized Zen temples, collected Chinese paintings, practiced tea ceremony, sponsored the development of No theater, which incorporated Zen aesthetics into performance. Slow movement, symbolic gesture, minimal staging, moments of complete stillness where the actor simply stands, exists, the stillness itself becoming the performance. This period also saw the development of five mountain literature, poetry, and prose written by Zen monks in classical Chinese, demonstrating learning and cultural refinement. These writings are now mostly forgotten, read primarily by specialists, which seems like a shame but also reflects how cultural tastes change, how what was once prestigious becomes obscure, how nothing, not even Zen literature, about the emptiness of all things, escapes impermanence. Individual Zen masters during this period became cultural celebrities, their words recorded, their calligraphy collected, their teaching styles emulated. Ikkyu Sojun, a 15th century Rinzai master, became particularly famous for his unconventional behavior, frequenting taverns, consorting with prostitutes, writing poetry that was sometimes obscene, generally violating expectations for how enlightened monks should behave. His actions were understood as expressions of freedom from conventional morality, demonstrations that enlightenment transcends social rules, though they might also have just been a monk enjoying life's pleasures and using Zen philosophy as justification, which would be very human and not necessarily wrong. Ikkyu wrote, "Many paths lead from Mo, the foot of the mountain, but at the peak, we all gaze at the single bright moon." This suggests all religious paths ultimately lead to the same realization, which is ecumenical and generous, and probably true, though it also somewhat undermines the claim that Zen is uniquely direct or superior to other traditions, which might be why some Zen teachers emphasize this universality, while others insist on Zen's special status, creating the usual tensions between inclusivity and institutional identity. The Edo period, 17th to 19th centuries, the Tokugawa shogunate required every family to register with a temple, creating a system where temples functioned partly as religious institutions and partly as government bureaucracy. This provided stable funding and social position, but also reduced revolutionary potential, made Zen respectable and established, less concerned with enlightenment than with maintaining traditions, performing funerals, administering temple lands. Some Zen masters during this period tried to revitalize the tradition, emphasizing rigorous practice over institutional maintenance. Hakuin Ekaku, an 18th-century Rinzai master, reformed koan study, systematized the training process, created new koans, and wrote extensively about his own struggles and realizations. He's particularly famous for the koan, not a traditional Chinese koan, but Hakuin's own creation, which became perhaps the most recognizable Zen question in popular culture. Usually misunderstood as a riddle with a clever answer, rather than a meditation device meant to exhaust conceptual thinking. Hakuin experienced what he described as multiple enlightenment experiences, suggesting that enlightenment isn't a single permanent state, but something that deepens, that has stages or layers, that you can lose and regain or experience partially and then more fully. This contradicts the idea of sudden, complete, permanent enlightenment, but probably reflects actual practice more accurately, as most practitioners report varying states of clarity and confusion, moments of insight interspersed with periods of ordinary consciousness, rather than a permanent shift into some transcendent state, which would be nice, but seems statistically rare. Another important figure from this period is Ryokan, a Soto monk who lived simply, alone in a small hut, writing poetry, playing with children, begging for food, apparently unconcerned with institutional Buddhism or establishing a teaching lineage. His poetry is simple, direct, often about ordinary activities, walking in mountains, playing ball with children, sitting alone watching snowfall. He wrote, "Too lazy to be ambitious, I let the world take care of itself. 10 days' worth of rice in my bag, a bundle of twigs by the fireplace. Why chatter about delusion and enlightenment? Listening to the night rain on my roof, I sit comfortably with both legs stretched out. This is either profound wisdom or sophisticated laziness, or both." Ryokan represents a strand of Zen that's less concerned with achievement, even spiritual achievement, more concerned with simply living, being present, finding sufficiency in simplicity. He never formally taught, never established a temple, never claimed any particular status. Yet his poetry and his life story became influential, suggesting that sometimes the most powerful teaching is just living authentically, demonstrating possibility through example rather than instruction. The Meiji Restoration in 1868 brought significant changes to Japanese Buddhism. The new government pursued modernization, westernization, and briefly anti-Buddhist policies. Buddhist temples lost land and funding. Monks were pressured to marry and abandon monastic life. Traditions that had persisted for centuries faced existential threat. Zen adapted by emphasizing its compatibility with modern rationalism, its practical benefits for mental training, its potential application to secular life. Some Zen teachers began presenting Zen not as religion but as psychology, as meditation technique, as philosophy, downplaying supernatural elements, emphasizing direct experience and empirical verification. This made Zen more acceptable to modern, scientifically minded Japanese, but also changed its character, made it more this-worldly, more pragmatic, less concerned with ultimate questions about karma, rebirth, and enlightenment. During this period, D.T. Suzuki Daisetsu Taitaro. Suzuki lived for periods in America, taught at various universities, wrote numerous books explaining Zen concepts in terms Western readers could understand. His work was enormously influential, shaping how the West understood Zen. Though some scholars argue he oversimplified, romanticized, or misrepresented traditional Zen to make it more palatable to Western audiences, emphasizing spontaneity and naturalness, while downplaying the rigorous discipline and institutional structures that actual Zen practice involves. Suzuki's books appeared at an opportune moment, looking for spiritual practices compatible with modern skepticism. His presentation of Zen as direct, experiential, non-dogmatic, and psychologically sophisticated appealed to this audience, creating an image of Zen that was probably more idealized than accurate, but was tremendously influential in spreading Zen's reputation beyond Japan. World War II complicated Zen's history significantly. Some Zen institutions and teachers supported Japanese militarism, provided religious justification for war, argued that Zen training produced better soldiers, that selfless action in battle. This collaboration with nationalism and militarism is a dark chapter that Zen institutions have been reluctant to fully acknowledge or examine, preferring to maintain the image of Zen as purely peaceful and apolitical, which history demonstrates it wasn't and isn't. As spiritual traditions exist within political contexts and are influenced by them, regardless of their teachings about transcending worldly concerns. After the war, Zen in Japan faced challenges of relevance and authenticity. Monasteries continued operating, training monks, maintaining traditions, but increasingly served primarily as funeral services for families, with meditation and enlightenment becoming secondary to ritual functions. Some teachers lamented this decline, attempted reforms, tried to return to what they saw as Zen's essential purpose, but institutional inertia is powerful, and once traditions become primarily about maintaining themselves rather than serving their original purpose, change becomes difficult. Meanwhile, Zen began spreading to the West more substantially, carried by both Japanese teachers who traveled abroad and Western students who studied in Japan, then returned home to teach. This Western Zen is interesting and deserves its own extended discussion, which we'll provide, because discussing things at extended length is what we do, and if you're still awake, you're either genuinely interested or have developed insomnia that requires medical attention rather than historical narration. The arrival of Zen in the West happened in waves, with different periods characterized by different levels of understanding, and varying amounts of actual practice versus theoretical appreciation. The earliest Western encounters with Zen were primarily intellectual scholars and philosophers reading about Buddhism, translating texts, trying to understand Eastern thought through Western philosophical frameworks, which is rather like trying to understand music by reading descriptions of it. Possible in theory, but missing something essential. The 1893 World's Parliament of Religions in Chicago, which we mentioned briefly in our tea ceremony discussion, included presentations on Buddhism, including Zen, though the presenters struggled to convey concepts that didn't translate easily into Western religious vocabulary. Westerners hearing about Buddhism for the first time tried to fit it into familiar categories. Was it a religion, a philosophy, a psychology? Not quite grasping that it might be all of these and none of these. that the categories themselves might be the problem. Early 20th century interest in Zen came primarily from intellectuals, artists, and people dissatisfied with conventional Western religion. They read translations, attended lectures, discussed concepts like emptiness and non-duality, creating what might be called philosophical Zen or theoretical Zen, appreciating the ideas without embodying the practice, which is like reading cookbooks without cooking. You understand recipes intellectually. D.T. Suzuki's lecture tours in America during the 1950 seconds brought Zen to wider attention. He spoke at universities, engaged with Western psychologists and philosophers, presented Zen as compatible with modern thought, emphasized direct experience over ritual or doctrine. His audiences included people who would become influential in spreading Zen further. Psychologists like Erich Fromm, who saw connections between Zen and psychoanalysis. Artists like John Cage, who incorporated Zen principles into experimental music. Writers like Jack Kerouac and Allen Ginsberg, who romanticized Zen as part of beat culture's rebellion against conventional American values. The beat interpretation of Zen is interesting primarily for how much it misunderstood while simultaneously spreading awareness. Kerouac's novel The Dharma Bums presents Zen as spontaneous, anti-intellectual, aligned with jazz, alcohol, casual sex, and hitchhiking, a kind of spiritual bohemianism that had very little to do with actual Zen practice, which involves getting up at 3:30 a.m. to sit still for hours in cold meditation halls following strict rules. Considerably less romantic than drinking wine and discussing enlightenment in San Francisco coffee houses. Gary Snyder, another beat writer, actually studied Zen seriously, spending years in Japanese monasteries, learning Japanese, practicing formally. His writing about Zen was more grounded, more accurate, though perhaps less exciting than Kerouac's romanticized version. Snyder recognized that Zen practice was difficult, disciplined work, not simply spontaneous freedom, though he also appreciated how Zen principles could inform engagement with nature, with ecology, with finding spiritual depth in physical labor and wilderness experience. The 1960 seconds brought increased Western interest in Eastern spirituality generally, driven partly by countercultural movements seeking alternatives to mainstream American values, partly by increased travel and cultural exchange, partly by psychedelic experiences that seemed to produce states of consciousness similar to those described in mystical traditions, making people think maybe these ancient practices were onto something. Whether drug-induced states actually resemble meditative insights is debatable, but the perception that they did motivated many people to explore meditation, seeking to achieve naturally what they'd experienced chemically. During this period, Japanese Zen teachers began establishing centers in America and Europe, creating formal training opportunities for Western students. Suzuki. Different Suzukis founded the San Francisco Zen Center in 1962, establishing a community that would become one of the most influential Zen institutions in America. His book, Zen Mind, Beginner's Mind, compiled from talks to his students, became enormously popular, presenting Zen in clear, accessible language while maintaining authenticity to traditional practice. Shunryu Suzuki emphasized beginner's mind, approaching practice without preconceptions, maintaining openness and curiosity even after years of experience. not letting knowledge become obstacle to direct perception. This concept resonated with Western students who appreciated being told that not knowing was acceptable, even valuable, that expertise could be a hindrance, that maintaining fresh perspective mattered more than accumulating information. He established Tassajara Zen Mountain Center in 1967, the first Zen monastery in the West, located in California's coastal mountains, remote and demanding. Students lived there year-round, following monastic schedules, practicing intensively, creating a community dedicated to Zen training in a way that hadn't existed in the West before. The center still operates today. Taizan Maezumi Roshi, Maezumi integrated Rinzai and Soto approaches, used both koan study and shikantaza meditation, created a hybrid style that drew from multiple Japanese lineages while adapting to Western students' needs and questions. He trained many Western teachers who went on to establish their own centers, creating a network of Zen communities across America. Ido Tai Shimano Roshi established the New York Zendo in 1968, bringing Rinzai Zen to the East Coast. The New York Center attracted urban professionals, intellectuals. This urban model practicing Zen, while maintaining ordinary jobs and family responsibilities, became important in Western Zen's development, as most Western students couldn't or wouldn't commit to full-time monastic life. These early centers faced challenges of cultural translation. How do you practice Japanese Zen in America without simply replicating Japanese culture? Do you maintain Japanese language for ceremonies? Require traditional robes? Bow in the Japanese style? Or adapt forms to Western context while preserving essential principles? Different centers answered these questions differently. Some teachers insisted on maintaining Japanese forms strictly, arguing that the forms themselves were teachings, that seemingly external elements like bowing and ritual carried meaning that would be lost through adaptation. Students at these centers learned Japanese chanting, wore traditional robes, maintained Japanese aesthetic elements in their meditation halls, creating spaces that felt transplanted from Japan despite being in California or New York or wherever. Other teachers adapted more freely, translating chants into English, allowing casual clothing during practice, incorporating Western elements, Christian contemplative practices, psychotherapy insights, democratic decision-making processes, creating something hybrid, something neither purely Japanese nor purely American, but a synthesis, a new expression of ancient principles in contemporary context. The question of authority and hierarchy created particular tensions. Japanese Zen operates within strict hierarchical structures. The teacher's word is law. Students don't question decisions. Obedience is virtue. Hierarchy is clear and unchallenged. This works reasonably well in Japanese cultural context, where hierarchical relationships are normal and accepted across society. But in America, where egalitarianism and questioning authority are cultural values, these structures created problems. Some Western students accepted traditional hierarchy, even appreciated it as relief from having to make decisions, as clear structure in which to practice. Others chafed against it, felt infantilized, wanted more voice in community decisions, more transparency in how centers operated, more accountability for teachers. These tensions led to conflicts in several prominent Zen communities. The issue of teacher misconduct deserves discussion. Multiple prominent Zen teachers in the West engaged in sexual relationships with students, abused alcohol, mishandled money, or otherwise violated ethical standards while claiming to be enlightened masters. These scandals rocked Western Zen communities about whether enlightenment actually makes people better or just gives them better justifications for doing whatever they want. The San Francisco Zen Center experienced a major crisis in the early 1982 when Richard Baker, who had been installed as abbot after Shunryu Suzuki's death, was revealed to be having affairs with students. Living lavishly, the community asked him to resign, creating turmoil but also opening conversations about authority, transparency, and accountability that hadn't happened before. Similar scandals occurred at other centers, teachers sleeping with students, financial improprieties, alcohol abuse, authoritarian behavior justified as crazy wisdom or skillful means. These incidents damaged communities, traumatized students, and forced Western Zen to examine its assumptions about enlightenment, about teacher-student relationships, about importing traditional Asian structures without the cultural safeguards that had evolved alongside them. Some communities responded by developing ethics policies, creating boards to oversee teachers, establishing procedures for handling complaints, generally attempting to maintain Zen's transformative practice while acknowledging that meditation doesn't automatically make people ethical and that power corrupts regardless of how much zazen you've done. This process is ongoing, still evolving, still struggling with how to honor teachers' insights and experience while preventing abuse of authority. The feminist critique of Zen also emerged during this period. Women noticed they were underrepresented in teaching positions, that traditional Zen stories featured almost exclusively male masters, that certain assumptions about gender roles persisted in supposedly non-discriminatory communities. Female practitioners began questioning whether Zen's supposed universality actually was universal, or whether it carried unexamined patriarchal assumptions from its Asian origins. Some female teachers established women's practice groups, exploring whether women experienced meditation differently, whether the aggressive, confrontational style of some Zen teaching particularly suited male psychology but alienated women. These questions don't have simple answers, but asking them opened spaces for examining previously unquestioned assumptions. Women Zen teachers like Charlotte Joko Beck, Maureen Stewart, and Toni Packer developed distinctive teaching styles, often emphasizing psychological integration alongside meditation, paying attention to emotional patterns, working with students' personal histories and traumas in ways traditional Zen sometimes dismissed as irrelevant to enlightenment. This created debate. Was this authentic Zen or Zen mixed with Western psychotherapy? Does it matter? Can Zen evolve to incorporate new insights, or must it maintain traditional forms unchanged? The integration of Zen and psychotherapy became increasingly common in Western practice. Many Zen students were also therapy clients or therapists themselves, noticed overlaps between sitting with difficult emotions in meditation and processing them in therapy, appreciated how both practices involved observing mind patterns without being controlled by them. Some teachers explicitly combined approaches, creating what might be called therapeutic Zen or psychological Buddhism. That Zen addresses ultimate truth. Jack Kornfield, Joseph Goldstein, and others developed insight meditation or vipassana practice in the West. drawing primarily from Theravada Buddhism rather than Zen, but addressing similar Western audiences, often overlapping in student populations. These teachers emphasized meditation practice stripped of Asian cultural elements, presented in secular language, accessible to anyone regardless of religious background. This approach became enormously popular, spawning the contemporary mindfulness movement that now permeates Western culture in forms ranging from hospital stress reduction programs to corporate productivity training to smartphone apps. The commodification and secularization of meditation raises questions about authenticity and effectiveness. Is meditation practice that's been removed from ethical framework and philosophical context still meaningful? Can you just take the meditation technique, sit still, watch your breath, and expect similar results without the supporting structure of Buddhist teaching about impermanence, non-self, compassion, the various factors that constitute the traditional path? Some argue that meditation without Buddhist framework is fine, perhaps even better, as it makes the practice accessible to more people, removes religious elements that might alienate secular audiences, allows scientific study of meditation's effects without getting tangled in metaphysical claims. Others argue that context matters, that meditation divorced from ethics and wisdom teachings is just stress reduction, which is valuable but not transformative, not addressing the deeper questions about meaning, purpose, and how to live that brought people to these practices originally. The scientific study of meditation began in earnest. Researchers like John Kabat-Zinn brought meditation into medical contexts, developing mindfulness-based stress reduction, programs for hospital patients dealing with chronic pain, anxiety, and various medical conditions. This medicalization of meditation made it respectable, emphasized measurable outcomes, reduced stress, improved attention, better emotional regulation rather than enlightenment or liberation, which are harder to measure with brain scans. Brain imaging studies showed that meditation produces measurable changes in brain structure and function, that regular practitioners develop thicker cortical regions associated with attention and sensory processing, that meditation reduces activity in the default mode network associated with self-referential thinking. This neuroscientific validation excited some practitioners, disappointed others, who felt reducing meditation to brain changes missed something important, something that couldn't be captured in fMRI data. The mindfulness movement that emerged from this medical and scientific work has become ubiquitous in contemporary Western culture. Schools teach mindfulness to children. Corporations offer mindfulness training to employees. Therapists incorporate mindfulness into various treatment modalities. Apps guide millions of people through brief meditation sessions. This widespread adoption represents success meditation practice, reaching populations who would never have entered a Zen center, but also dilution, as stripped of Buddhist context, reduced to self-help technique. Some Zen teachers embrace this development, happy that meditation practice is helping people regardless of religious framework. Others lament it, seeing essential teachings being lost, profound practice reduced to stress management. Both perspectives have validity. The digital age created new challenges and opportunities for Zen practice. Online Sanghas practice communities formed, connecting practitioners across geographic distances, providing access to teachings for people in areas without local Zen centers. But can you practice Zen online? Does sitting alone in your room, while connected via video conference, constitute true community practice? Does receiving teaching through a screen, rather than in person, lose something essential about the teacher-student relationship, which traditionally involved direct, embodied presence? The COVID-19 pandemic forced these questions as Zen centers worldwide closed physical spaces and moved practice online. Teachers conducted meditation sessions via video call, gave talks to audiences of Brady Bunch-style boxes of faces on screens, tried to maintain community while physically separated. Some aspects worked surprisingly well. Other aspects were clearly inadequate. You can't replicate the presence of sitting in a meditation hall with others, the silence between people in shared space, the nonverbal teaching that happens through simply being together. As centers reopened, questions emerged about whether to maintain online options, return entirely to in-person practice, or develop hybrid models. Different communities chose different approaches, creating more diversity in how Western Zen manifests, more options for practitioners, but also more fragmentation, less sense of unified tradition. Contemporary Western Zen exists in multiple forms, ranging from traditional training monasteries that closely follow Japanese models to casual meditation groups that might do 15 minutes of sitting, followed by social time. From teachers who maintain formal hierarchies and use traditional language to those who present Zen in entirely contemporary terms without robes, altars, or ritual. This diversity is either healthy adaptation or concerning fragmentation, depending on your perspective. Some lineages have developed distinctly Western expressions. The Ordinary Mind School, founded by Charlotte Joko Beck, emphasizes psychological work alongside meditation, uses conversational teaching rather than formal talks, maintains minimal ritual. The practice focuses on bringing awareness to daily life activities, working with emotional patterns, understanding how we create suffering through habitual mental and emotional patterns. This is recognizably Zen, but feels quite different from traditional Japanese practice, more accessible perhaps to Western students who find the formal ritual off-putting or the emphasis on sudden enlightenment unrealistic. Other teachers, like Bernie Glassman, developed engaged Buddhism, applying Zen practice to social issues, creating programs serving homeless populations, establishing companies, providing employment for disadvantaged workers, organizing street retreats, where practitioners spend several days living homeless to develop direct understanding of poverty and social marginalization. This social engagement draws from traditional Buddhist emphasis on compassion, but applies it in ways that address contemporary social problems, creating practice that's both meditative and activist. The question of what constitutes authentic Zen continues generating debate. Is Zen defined by specific meditation postures and techniques, by lineage transmission from authorized teachers, by realization of certain insights or experiences? Different teachers answer differently, creating Zen landscape that's bewilderingly diverse for newcomers trying to understand what Zen actually is. Some argue that Zen must maintain connection to traditional Asian forms, that the practices evolved over centuries and shouldn't be casually modified, that forms carry meaning even when that meaning isn't immediately apparent. Others argue that Zen has always adapted to new cultural contexts. Chinese Zen differed from Indian Buddhism. Japanese Zen differed from Chinese Chan. Korean Seon developed its own characteristics. So Western Zen should naturally develop Western expressions, preserving core insights while adapting external forms. The aging of first-generation Western Zen teachers created succession questions. These teachers, now in their 70s and 80s or already deceased, their successors second and now third generation, practicing in cultural context where Buddhism is familiar rather than exotic, teaching students who may have less romantic enthusiasm for Eastern spirituality than earlier generations. Some younger teachers are exploring post-lineage Zen, questioning whether the traditional emphasis on verified teacher-student transmission still makes sense in Western context, whether claims to enlightenment should be taken at face value or examined more skeptically. These questions challenge centuries of tradition, but also reflect Western cultural values, creating interesting tensions between respecting tradition and adapting to context. The academic study of Zen has also complicated matters. Scholars studying historical texts, examining original sources, sometimes discover that popular understanding of Zen differs significantly from historical reality, that certain stories are later inventions, that some traditional teachings may be medieval innovations rather than direct transmission from the Buddha. This scholarship is valuable, but can also be unsettling for practitioners who thought they were accessing ancient, authentic teachings only to discover that tradition. Contemporary neuroscience research continues revealing meditation's effects on brain and body, showing measurable benefits for attention, emotional regulation, stress response, even immune function. This validation is welcome, but also changes how meditation is understood and practiced. Measurable outcomes over ineffable realization. The integration of Zen with environmental activism has become increasingly prominent. Teachers like Joan Halifax emphasize contemplative activism, bringing meditative awareness to environmental and social justice work, preventing burnout, maintaining equanimity while engaging with difficult realities. This connects to traditional Buddhist teachings about interdependence, but applies these teachings to contemporary crises in ways historical Zen masters couldn't have anticipated. Some practitioners explore Zen's relationship with indigenous spiritual traditions, acknowledging that Western Zen is practiced on colonized land, that many practitioners of color experience Zen spaces as predominantly white and culturally alien. These conversations are ongoing, often uncomfortable, addressing questions about who Zen is for, whose voices are centered, what cultural assumptions are embedded in supposedly universal teachings. The commercialization of meditation continues accelerating. Books and courses about mindfulness proliferating endlessly. This makes meditation accessible, but also commodifies it, turns practice into product, reduces it to wellness technique, purchasable alongside gym memberships and organic groceries. Whether this is democratization or degradation remains actively debated. Zen centers face practical challenges maintaining themselves financially. Traditional Asian monasteries were supported by communities who saw supporting monks as religious merit-making. Western practitioners often expect to pay for services received. Centers operate as non-profits, rely on donations and membership fees, sometimes struggle to pay teachers adequately, maintain buildings, cover insurance. The economics of Western Zen don't always support traditional monastic model, forcing adaptation. sometimes uncomfortable compromises between spiritual ideals and financial necessities. Questions about cultural appropriation arise regularly. Is Western adoption of Zen appreciation or appropriation? Can non-Asian people teach Asian spiritual practices authentically? Should they? What obligations do Western practitioners have to understand and respect Asian cultures from which these practices emerged? These questions don't have simple answers, require ongoing attention, humility, willingness to listen to Asian and Asian American voices within Western Zen communities. Some Japanese observers view Western Zen, seeing it as either shallow imitation, missing essential cultural context, or interesting adaptation, creating something new that might even revitalize declining Zen practice in Japan, where temple attendance is low, young people uninterested, monasteries struggling to attract practitioners. The possibility that Western Zen might evolve, forms that could be transmitted back to Asia, completing a circle. The future of Zen in the West remains uncertain. Will it continue adapting, becoming increasingly Western, eventually unrecognizable from historical Zen? Will it maintain connection to traditional forms while developing local expressions? Will it fragment into multiple traditions barely related to each other? Will it fade as cultural fascination with Eastern spirituality wanes, replaced by new interests, new practices, new ways of addressing timeless questions about meaning, suffering, and how to live well? What seems likely is that meditation practice in some form will persist, finding peace amid difficulty. Whether these methods will be called Zen, whether they'll resemble what Chan masters practiced in 9th century China or Zen masters practiced in 17th century Japan, these questions remain open, will be answered through practice itself, through generations of practitioners exploring what works, what helps, what brings genuine transformation, rather than temporary peace or philosophical entertainment. And perhaps that uncertainty is appropriate, even necessary, as Zen has always emphasized direct experience over fixed forms, adaptation over rigid preservation, seeing clearly rather than following blindly, which suggests that Zen's future will be determined not by maintaining traditions unchanged, but by each generation discovering for themselves what's essential and what's cultural packaging, what transforms lives and what merely decorates them, what leads to genuine freedom and what creates new, subtler forms of bondage.